to. That. I will, over the next couple of days, hopefully have a chance to speak to many, even most of you, and I look forward to doing that. And maybe we'll do a little bit of housekeeping when the formalities are out of the way a little later on this morning. Brian.
Guramagat Mora, Honiste, again, usually Galer, Boalam Falcha, go all rove Hig. Campus na Neville, campus nu the Good DCU. There's just some words in our Irish language. Minister, distinguished guests, you're all very welcome here this morning to DCU All Hallows campus. And I'll say a little bit about the campus in a few minutes and some of the cultural shocks you may have received coming in. Delighted to welcome over 160 researchers, academics from, I believe, at least 3 continents to this important event. And on behalf of DCU, on behalf of the university itself, I want to warmly welcome you to the VOX-Pol Project Conference, where you're doing an important thing mid-term in any project, and that is taking stock of the research so far, but also, of course, networking. I'm particularly delighted that our Taoiseach, our Minister for Justice and Equality, Francis Fitzgerald, has taken time out of a very busy schedule to be with us here this morning. But I think it shows 2 things. One is the critical importance of this topic, and secondly, her own personal commitment to actually address it significantly for this nation itself and to contribute to the broader discussion on the topic. And we look forward to hearing her few words in a few minutes. Unfortunately, the topic we're dealing with is an ever-present issue for all of us, and with some serious examples of this all across the world, including close by us in recent weeks. So it's critically important that we address it. And in that regard, I'd just make the point that for those of us in universities, we have the privilege of actually spending some of our time creating new knowledge. But it's also a responsibility that we focus on translating that new knowledge into benefit for society around us. And the topic of violent online political extremism is one such area. And I think the paucity of research in this to date puts even greater pressure on us and to actually focus more deeply on it. We tend to default into the situation of thinking of violent jihadi extremism, but as we all know, I think it's across so many, it's not limited to any one ideology, it's spreading across so many areas of the world and so many dimensions. So it's critical that we understand this. And it's not unlike the drug situation in sport and so on. We have to keep ahead all the time of developments. And it's such a multidisciplinary area, an area of convergence. And I'm delighted to see so many representatives from those different dimensions: communications, computer science, criminology, ethics, international relations, politics, all here. And I think the discussion best happens within that convergence space itself. Before I introduce the Minister, I just better explain the campus. This old campus was established in 1842. It was a religious campus, originally for training priests to go forward and teach all nations. More recently, it was focusing on social justice, community relations, leadership. But this college here is closing down this year. And DCU, which is Ireland's fastest growing university, will be over 16,000 students this September, was very fortunate, with the support of government, I should add, to be able to acquire the campus itself, and we have huge plans. But we are a secular university, so the sort of cultural clash you would have seen coming in here in terms of religious symbols, well, that maybe explains that. But it's going through a piece of transition as we prepare for a whole raft of new students coming in this September itself. But for us to have a beautiful looking campus like this to accommodate our significant growth in students. In particular, the beautiful trees in the campus itself. It's known for its selection of trees. So if you get some time from your serious discussions, you might relax if the weather holds in the beautiful gardens. So it's now my pleasure and privilege to welcome the Taoiseach here to speak this morning, the Minister for Justice and Equality, someone who has strong, forthright views on issues of justice and has really taken time to focus on this particular issue for us here this morning. So without further ado, can I welcome Taoiseach Francis Fitzgerald to the podium.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, President, and can I wish you the very best of luck in your new campus here. a very interesting tradition here, and you've brought the university through huge change. You now have 16,000 students, and I want to wish you the very best in the future, and thank you for all of the work that you're doing for Irish education. You're playing an extremely central role, and indeed having this conference here today with Maura, I think it's a reflection of the cutting-edge issues which you have taken on both in Irish education and internationally. So I'd like to begin by welcoming our guests, our visitors here this morning. I hope you realise that we're in very good humour here today. You did hear about that goal last night, did you? I don't know if there's any Italians in the audience, but are there? There are. You'll forgive me if I say that we're very happy. We're very happy today with that wonderful goal last night. It's put the whole country into very good humour. As a politician, I hope it lasts, and we certainly should get a few days out of it, and we have the next match on Sunday. So we've also had some good weather this morning, so I hope that lasts for the duration of your visit and that you have a very good time while you're here in Dublin and that you enjoy our capital city. We also in the Dáil yesterday had our summer statement of our economic development, and we have been through a very difficult time in this country economically. But the good news at the moment is that we are the fastest growing economy. We've seen, thankfully, a huge dip in our unemployment rates. And we now have new issues in relation to many of the problems, if you like, of prosperity in terms of providing housing and dealing with other issues for our people. So you come at an interesting time to Dublin, and I'm sure you will find this seminar very useful and helpful. As has been said, it's about networking, it's about excellence and being at the cutting edge of your topic and having an opportunity to explore that. And as somebody who in my past life has been a member of European networks, I've certainly found them only to my advantage and to the advantage of the topic. And I think it's great credit to Maura and to all of you to be involved in the way you are in such an important topic of our times. You will recall in 2013, Maura, that when Ireland held the presidency of the Council of the European Union, and in the course of that presidency, Maura had the opportunity to set out the aims of the VOX-Pol project to the member states. And it was also during the term of that presidency that Ireland commenced a revision of the Union strategy for the countering of radicalisation and recruitment to terrorism, in which the obvious ongoing need to address the online dimension to radicalisation was recognised. And I can say to you, indeed, since that time, and indeed just 2 weeks ago, I was in Luxembourg at the Justice and Home Affairs Ministers' meeting, where this topic and the whole question of dealing with the challenges we face from terrorism was centre stage once again, including the topics that you're discussing over the next few days. Your project has a very specific focus on drilling into the detail of the phenomenon of online radicalisation. Of course, the online space plays roles in radicalising individuals to violence. That is undeniable. If nothing else, the internet and social media provide a mass medium for propaganda on a scale and with a sophistication never seen before. And we really are in many ways, and it varies obviously depending on one's interest and knowledge about this, but I think we really are only at early enough days of beginning to understand the depth of this phenomenon, and certainly from a political point of view and from a government point of view and across departments, we clearly have work to do. And it's a topic of huge interest, not just, of course, to a Justice Department, but right across the whole of government, and does need a whole of government response as well. And that's something that we've been discussing at the JHA meetings. I think we've lots of questions still to ask and to answer, including the impact on individuals, on our society. These are very key questions. We don't have all of the answers, as I say. What is the impact of the internet and social media in terms of radicalisation in a more personalised individual affair? Is that what it is, that operates more at the level of tapping into one-to-one experience? I think that's certainly part of the discussion. It's not the whole discussion, of course, because it's much more than that. But I think there are very interesting questions about whether it's individual vulnerability, as we've seen in certain situations, but we do need to get a better understanding of that phenomenon, and it will only be addressed, I believe, by very dedicated long-term research, such as you were doing, and it's absolutely key. And as someone who comes from a social work background and a social administration and sociology, I think the whole phenomenon, challenges at so many different levels. At a societal level, an individual level. There are so many different aspects, and I think your programme reflects that. We will all recall the spirit of hope for a democratic future that the Arab Spring offered to many millions across North Africa and the Middle East. The reality has unfortunately turned out very differently because of the instability created by the overthrow of regimes. It has been exploited by extremists, and we have seen appalling bloodshed. In particular, we have witnessed the ongoing tragedy of civil war in Syria and the rise of the Islamic State, a group set apart by its particular and peculiar appetite for unspeakable levels of violence and oppression. I think the inhumanity of which has just left us all absolutely speechless. And the consequences have been very far-reaching. We've seen appalling bloodshed, not only but principally in Iraq and Syria, and we have also seen a migration crisis of historic proportions. We gave a commitment to have 4,000, for example, Syrian refugees in this country. And when I went to meet some of the first Syrians who arrived in here, and when you sit down and talk to people at an individual level, and the scale of the impact on those families, the life-changing events they've witnessed, the horrors they've been through, and the difficulties they're now experiencing in relation to getting a safe haven, it just brings into that really stark relief the appalling individual and family consequences. And when I see for example, some of the Syrians who are here were showing me the photographs of their homes in different parts of Syria, and to see their communities absolutely destroyed. Their whole way of life gone. And indeed some relatives still in those places like Aleppo and elsewhere. It certainly brings home to you precisely what we are dealing with. Over the course of the period we're speaking about, we've seen also the rise of the phenomenon of young men and women radicalized by many means and traveling to train or participate in conflict with extremist groups. These foreign terrorist fighters, as they have become known, have fallen prey to the very violent ideology of the Islamic State, or groups like it, who, like Al-Qaeda before them, have hijacked faith to justify brutal self-interest. And it was perhaps sadly inevitable that some of the individuals would return home, radicalized, trained, and motivated to commit violent acts, which is so challenging for all our states. Extremism, unfortunately, is no longer an abstract problem that happens somewhere else. It's here, it's right across Europe. In recent years, we've also seen the sophisticated, premeditated and shocking attacks by groups of radicalized people, notably the recent attacks in Paris and Brussels. We've also seen very indiscriminate acts of killing, violence, the recent brutal killing of the French police officer and his wife. These attacks have involved individuals who have claimed the ideology of Islamic State as their motivation. But we must, of course, recall that not all of this violence is perpetrated by people motivated by conflict in the Middle East. We have also seen, as the President mentioned, the rise of the extreme xenophobic or nationalistic tendency, the cold and calculated mass slaughter we saw in Norway, the tragic, mindless murder last week of the British MP, Joe Cox, point up a radicalization to violence motivated by a different ideology, but one that is no less founded in hatred. It is firmly recognised at European Union level that addressing this problem is not only a matter of deploying the traditional policing and security approaches to countering terrorism. Measures such as these are entirely appropriate and necessary, as I'm sure you'll all agree, in the context of keeping our citizens safe in the face of the current terrorist threat, and will continue to form a very key part of the response to the threat that we face. The actions we take in cooperation with our EU colleagues must strike a balance. While migration crisis with humanity and respect for fundamental rights, these are core values for us, we must also ensure that we protect our borders from abuse. And I think one of the more challenging aspects of the discussions we've had in recent times is where migration can be sometimes equated, with threats that we face as our society, and we have to be very clear about how we respond in a humanitarian and human rights way to the huge refugee crisis that we face, while at the same time being conscious of the security issues and the abuse of the migration routes that can be undertaken by those who seek to do harm. And that's a very real issue that we have to be ever alert to. So we do have to enhance our security response by increasing the resources devoted to it, particularly by developing smarter systems for the greater sharing of intelligence and information in order to seek to prevent attacks. At the Justice and Home Affairs Ministers' meeting again, just 2 weeks ago, we spent much time discussing the whole interoperability of databases. And I know as a group of academics very interested in working hard in this whole area, you will be very challenged, I think, and we are all challenged by the debate between privacy and sharing of information and security. And I don't think anyone has the complete answer to this, but it is certainly an issue we need to think very carefully about, because we don't want to sacrifice basic values, and at the same time we have to ensure that we protect our citizens, and these are difficult challenges. We do want to protect a society that values privacy and free expression as basic rights, and we don't want to unnecessarily impinge on these freedoms. And I think this is going to be a real debate in the years ahead, this balancing. We saw it in the European Parliament, for example, where the Justice and Home Affairs Ministers were very much pushing to have the passenger name records directive implemented for obvious reasons. And we saw the European Parliament debate that took place there where they rather reluctantly came round, and one can understand the range of concerns to supporting the PNR, and did finally after we had the Brussels tragedy. The decentralised and almost individualised nature often of the current internationalist terror threat and how it has evolved and is motivated requires, as I've said, a broader response to support security measures, and perhaps asks deeper questions of us as a society. And the questions I would raise in relation to this whole debate are, and I think they inevitably arise, they're questions about minority communities, how and whether our traditional social values and organisations are open to change and evolution that respects and embraces minorities, how we can work against social and economic disadvantage that may tend to isolate communities or individuals and sometimes makes those communities more vulnerable, not just to the type of crime we're talking about here today, but to all sorts of crime. And clearly dealing with socio-economic disadvantage in protecting individuals. And we also, another question is how any and all of these factors can make some more vulnerable than others to being preyed upon by extremists. And yet it must be recognised that the vast majority of people simply wish to go about their lives in peace and to make a positive contribution to society. They do not support or resort to violence. They value democratic principles and the freedoms that they underpin. Whether it is our majority or minority communities, we must be extremely careful that none should be stigmatised by the actions of a few. There is always a risk that the freedoms and rights we strive so hard to protect can, as I said, become eroded by the very measures that seek to preserve them. The tasks that faces us in this regard is writ large in the area of information and data sharing for police and security services, and how that can be facilitated and enhanced while at the same time guaranteeing privacy and data protection. There is significant work in the EU on this topic. As you know, it's been a constant theme for my discussions with colleagues and will continue to be an area of activity, as I've said. I've already mentioned about the debate, the very interesting debate on the PNR. Indeed, all of the proposals are founded in the data protection agreed at EU level that I hope will provide a modern data protection framework which will give citizens enhanced confidence that the protection of their personalised data is regulated clearly, robustly and proportionately, especially when it is used by law enforcement for combating crime and terrorism. As I said earlier, and as you know very well more than anyone, the online space has also become a major propaganda platform for international terrorism and for radicalising individuals to violent acts. How people communicate has changed. Don't need to go over it here. But clearly the change in communications has allowed people to access and communicate information in so many positive ways. But it has also allowed those with malicious motives to do the same. And it isn't acceptable that the preaching of hatred and violence should go unaddressed in this forum, in this online forum. There is a strong realization of the need for governments and the major tech companies and internet service providers to work together on this issue. I don't have time to go into the details of the various initiatives that are taking place both at European and national in relation to that partnership between tech companies and government, but I think there's great potential there. And I know there are representatives from I think there's much that we can do at an informal level as well as perhaps at a legislative level, but I wouldn't underestimate how much can be done in terms of partnership and that relationship between the internet service providers and governments. And I think that partnership will be crucial to our efforts to create a safer online environment, but because it is our young people and the most vulnerable in our societies that can be most susceptible to those preaching hatred and violent radicalization. That said, I do want to conclude by commenting on the work that you do. Obviously, the empirical research that takes a long-term and interdisciplinary approach can help us to identify with much more certainty exactly what are the factors that are involved in online violent radicalization. I do believe, and I'm a strong believer in this, that effective policies can be built on credible research. In fact, it would be my view that we need to have much more contact between the research community and move more and more towards policy based on good, high-quality research. And I think there's scope for a lot more bridge building between our universities and politicians, and I think our universities recognise that. It's all a question, I think, of having the right mechanisms in place in order to do that. But I think it can only be to the benefit of the policies that we all hope to see in place if we can build that partnership as well. I suppose one Minister for Children is how much we need to develop those bridge-building mechanisms and those partnerships to ensure that we have effective government, both across departmentally and cross institutions. I think it's really critical, and as researchers, I think you will appreciate that. I'll conclude again by welcoming our guest speakers. Thank you for taking the time to come to this seminar, and well done to DCU, Tamora and President Breen for giving you all of the opportunity to do your valuable work here in Dublin. Thank you very much for being here, and I hope you have a very useful and enjoyable seminar. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, so our first keynote speaker today is Dunya Mijatovic, who is the OSCE's representative on freedom of the media. In 2007, she was elected chair of the European Platform of Regulatory Agencies, and she also chaired the Council of Europe's group of specialists on freedom of expression and information in times of crisis. Mijatovic is an expert in human rights, communications and media strategy, and regulatory and media policy. She has also many years of experience in issues related to journalist safety and new media, including digitalization, convergence, and the internet. Dunya.
Good morning. Tonishte, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to be back to Dublin, to enjoy wonderful hospitality, but also great cooperation that I established already in 2012 during the chairmanship of the Organization for Security and Cooperation that I work for of Ireland. Those were the times when we were starting to talk about online world and how to tackle issues that are so important for our life, for our well-being, and for the issues that this project is trying to tackle. I'm very honored to have been invited to address you here today on what has become one of the most challenging and difficult tests of our time: how to tackle violent extremism and terrorism without undermining our fundamental freedoms, civil liberties, and how do we do this with the full respect of human rights and democratic values. I'm particularly delighted to be able to talk to such an eclectic mix of academics and experts, and I hope some journalists, who, through your dedicated efforts and research, are making important contributions in moving this discussion forward. And I cannot emphasize enough the role of academia, the role universities should play in trying to discuss and tackle these issues. It is crucial, and it's becoming more important for all that are engaging in these discussions. We cannot let just international organizations or civil society or industry discussing this without proper research, proper data, and scientific view on the issues that are extremely important nowadays. On early morning in June last year, an 18-year-old Norwegian citizen was at an airport outside Gothenburg in Sweden. A covert investigation launched a couple of months earlier showed that the young ethnic Norwegian was increasingly being radicalized and that he attempted to go to Syria to join ISIL-Daesh. In the late afternoon on the very same day, police came to the house of well-known Norwegian filmmaker Ulrik Rolfsen. He was working on a film on extreme Islamism and the recruitment of foreign fighters, to which the 18-year-old contributed. Through surveillance of communications, the police had information that Rolfsen was in possession of recordings that, in the police's opinion, would be significant evidence in the criminal case against the radicalized 18-year-old. The police searched the filmmaker's house, where his film studio was also located, and seized unpublished material consisting of 6 to 8 hours of recordings he did with the young man. The material was sealed and handed over to district court the next day, with the request to maintain the seizure. The filmmaker, of course, protested, claiming it would be in violation of his journalist's right to protection of sources. This real-time scenario, taken from a country with some of the finest democratic tradition, is illustrative of the new threats to free security concerns in Europe. And it's extremely important, and I'm really thankful that you invited me to talk about this angle, that is somehow pushed away, put under the carpet, and everything in the name of security. You will probably hear some views you disagree with, but you also have to bear with my views and the mission I have. And the mission is to promote and protect freedom of speech and freedom of the media. In literally all OSCE states, and there are 57, we start the region from the OSCE, from US, Canada, all the way to Europe, covering all EU member states, the Balkan part of the world that I come from. I'm from Sarajevo, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, all the way to Russia, Central Asia, South Caucasus, and our youngest participating states, Mongolia. So you can only imagine how difficult it is to tackle all these issues that are related to free speech. But of course, at this event, I'm going to focus on the topic of the day. So in literally all the states, I see more or less the same. Journalists and other media actors are forced to hand over their unpublished material and reveal their sources to police in terror probes. Journalists and their sources are increasingly subject to surveillance and other forms of interception of communication. Content is being blocked online, and journalists are attacked, intimidated, imprisoned, while reporting on terrorism-related issues, all, again, in the name of security. What is not illustrative with this case from Norway, however, is how the case eventually minutes in my introduction to you here today. In a remarkable ruling on 15th of November last year, the Norwegian decision to uphold the seizure. The Supreme Court found anonymity for broad protection against exposure of journalistic sources, even in the context of a government's anti-terror investigation. In contrast to the widespread international tendency to sacrifice freedom of expression in times of crisis, the ruling recognizes the crucial importance of a free press. For this reason, this ruling, this legal decision, was also awarded the 2016 Columbia Global Freedom of Expression Award for the most significant ruling last year. I think the court hit the nail on the head when describing Rolfsen's documentary At the Heart of Investigative Journalism, and pointing out that the project addressed a central and urgent problem in a society about which the general public and authorities have a need for knowledge and insight. Those things should not be hidden from people. The only way this project was made possible was through the trust the filmmaker had with his sources. Effective protection of these sources was accordingly by the judges considered vital to creating the documentary and for the public's right to information. As I stated then, publicly, following the ruling, the decision should serve as an example for how similar issues should be dealt with in other countries. Democracies should lead by example. And this is the issue that I'm raising with participating states that are traditionally safe haven for free speech, for the respect of human rights. If they fail, if we fail, then what do you think is going to happen in other parts of the world? That is why I'm sometimes too critical when it comes to the moves I see from many states that, again, should be leading by example. And I will name several. I'm, however, not too optimistic. Even though in my work I have to be optimistic, in order to protect free speech and freedom of the media, you need to be optimistic. But when it comes to the moves of governments of the OSCE participating states and beyond, I'm not optimistic. All over the region and beyond, I see governments attempting to counter violent extremism and terrorism by adopting measures, initiating programs and initiatives that restrict freedom of expression, privacy, and other human rights. Should we not be willing to give up some of our freedoms in exchange of greater security, is the question I ask from time to time. After the brutal terrorist attacks in Paris last year, when the whole world was left in dismay after the killing of, among other, 8 journalists at Charlie Hebdo, we questioned ourselves. How could this happen? How could a terrorist in such a well-coordinated attack on one of the most obvious terror goals in Europe escape the radar of some of the world's best intelligence services in a world where so many digital clues and traces are left behind? But 10 months later, despite massive security arrangements and expanded surveillance powers in France, terrorists managed to strike again. Some media reports allege that terrorists used encrypted applications to communicate with each other, adding yet another concern to government's ability to access information on terrorist activities. Without doubt, the terrorist attacks in 2015 created a special momentum, a dangerous momentum, for European lawmakers and policymakers to rethink the concept of security and surveillance. They ask themselves whether cooperation and sharing of information between police and intelligence services is sufficient. Is enough information being gathered? Are the police powers to search and analyze data great enough? Should there be restraints on the use of encrypted and anonymous communications? These are all the questions that governments are asking themselves, but also civil society, international organizations, all of us engaging in this struggle and fight against the evil. At the very outset, I think we need to reject the idea that security and liberty should exist in some sort of balance with each other, meaning that a gain in one comes at the expense of the other. Security and human rights should not be looked upon as opposite or contradicting values. Governments and societies must recognize that there is no reason or excuse to justify the erosion of or violation of the fundamental human rights which form the bedrock of modern democracies. The challenge of our time is to understand that security is a component of human rights. Without the full enjoyment of human rights, there is no security. This is the idea Benjamin Franklin referred to in his iconic quote, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." In my work, I do fully recognize, first, the reality we live in, and then I fully respect the importance of any government's legitimate right and security efforts in order to make our society safer. And who would challenge that? That is also the role of the government. But then again, not at the expense of respect of human rights. And this is something we should not forget. While the internet had brought unprecedented possibilities for communications, it is indeed also exploited by violent extremists to spread hateful propaganda, as we heard from Toniste, incite acts of terrorism, radicalize and recruit new members, and facilitate communications for organizational and operational purposes. But fighting the use of the internet for terrorist purposes, as well as revealing and prosecuting other serious crimes, require principled thinking and a firm and steady approach. All necessary mechanisms protecting free expression and media freedom must be preserved in order not to obstruct journalists' work. As the OSCE representative on freedom of media, I'm mandated to closely observe laws, policies, and other forms of interventions by participating states, which might interfere in the exercise of free expression and free media. These include, of course, media laws and regulations, but it is a brutally honest fact that more and more of my work relates to anti-terrorist legislation and policies. We live in a very dangerous time, and this is something we should also not forget or neglect. It is, in a way, time where things dramatically changed. Europe looks different. Recent terrorist attacks and new lines of conflict in Europe are fundamentally altering and challenging the way we think about our basic human rights, such as freedom of expression and privacy. We see a shrinking place for civil society, journalists, and human rights defenders, and they are increasingly subject to harassment. NGOs are being restricted in their activities, and media freedom is decreasing. And this is all happening as we speak. And this is all happening in many countries of the OSCE that are calling themselves democracies. But as the international official and their representative on freedom of the media, I strongly disagree. It is a sad fact that our very own security has become one of the greatest threats to freedom of speech. At the same time, our societies are marked by an atmosphere with increasing intolerance of dissenting opinion. Taken together, I fear that these factors have created a dangerous cocktail, I would say, of suppression and self-censorship in Europe and beyond. I will mention also several countries that are on my radar when it comes to adoption of the laws that are potentially or directly restricting free speech. Just consider the anti-terror law in Turkey, in effect since 1991. This law is now being used to round on alleged terrorists and others, including members of the media. Only yesterday, I had to raise my voice and to use my mandate to talk about the imprisonment of Erol Önderoğlu and two other journalists who were detained and then arrested by the Turkish authorities for spreading terrorist propaganda. Erol Önderoğlu is a friend, and he is a trusted colleague and representative of Reporters Sans Frontières for Turkey. So the last person you would point your finger at, saying that that person is spreading terrorist propaganda. So this is also the way some governments are using their authority in order to stop restrictive, provocative voices that are challenging issues of concern. In Russian Federation, The Duma adopted changes in the Code of Administrative Offenses last year. These changes substantially increase penalties for media found to be producing or publishing materials containing public calls for publicly justifying extremist or terrorist activities, although terrorist and extremist activities are never specifically defined. So it is used to suppress critical voices, not actually to fight extremism and terrorism. In Canada, Bill C-51, intended to fight terrorism, is still under consideration in Parliament. The last draft criminalizes a number of vague offenses, including advocating and promoting terrorism or recklessness in carrying out your activities could lead to terrorist acts being committed. I can think of nothing as confusing as such vaguely worded legislation that has the potential to determine whether anyone who simply disagrees with government policy is found to be criminally liable for someone else's potential behavior. And this is happening all the time. The United Kingdom, as an example on surveillance, where the Investigatory Powers Bill passed the House of Commons earlier this month, despite major human rights concerns expressed both nationally and internationally. Among others, the bill gives powers to issue bulk warrants without the existence of reasonable suspicion before issuing the surveillance measure. This is clearly running counter to principles set out by the European Court of Human Rights. It has flaws in control mechanisms, as recently pointed out by the Parliament's very own Committee on Human Rights, which submitted proposals to improve the bill to further enhance the compatibility of the legal framework with human rights. And journalists, they pay so much attention on how to cover their tracks that they end up in a way feeling like spies instead of journalists because of all these attempts by different governments trying to reveal sources, trying to find out who do they talk to, using surveillance powers and all these other mechanisms in order to find out what certain journalists, filmmakers, or human rights defenders are trying to cover. Because surveillance activities may fundamentally alter the way the state protects the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information, any legislation that allows government snooping must be narrowly drawn, proportionate, and include guarantees as a basic precondition for investigative journalism that confidentiality of journalist sources would not be compromised. Accordingly, an effective and thorough judicial review, which is on so many occasions recently neglected. Many governments, including French government, is totally pushing away judicial oversight in order to tackle these issues. And these are dangers of our time. This is something that not too many are talking about because it's uncomfortable. Governments do not like to be criticized. They do not like to hear things similar to what I'm saying. And that is why I think it's extremely important that we keep talking and really pointing finger when we see that our civil liberties and our rights are in danger. It is also of utmost importance to maintain the right to communicate anonymously and via encrypted technologies. As it was highlighted in a report last year from a good friend, a UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay, encryption and anonymity provide the privacy and security necessary for the exercise of the right to freedom of expression in the digital age. It may also be essential for exercising other human rights. It is also important to remember that introducing regulation on encryption, among others allowing to backdoors where governments can slide in, will also make encrypted files vulnerable for terrorists and other criminals. The second main category of threats is online censorship. Policies and practices related to content takedown, blocking, filtering measures online remains an increasing concern, as they frequently are in violation of the state's obligations to guarantee freedom of expression. They are not respecting the principles that apply for restricting free expression. As thoroughly outlined in my office's recently published guidebook that I invite you to find on the web, Media Freedom on the Internet, it was written by a colleague, a a legal expert, professor at the Bilgi University in Istanbul, Yaman Akdeniz, where he looked at the issues of transparency, accountability, and the right to reply. In many countries, these decisions are also made by administrative bodies that lack independent judicial oversight. The Polish Parliament adopted a new Counter-Terrorism Act last week, which, among others, gives the Internal Security Agency the mandate to block websites deemed a threat to national security. Again, no judicial oversight. The courts are given 5 days to review the legitimacy of the blocking, but then there is also additional mechanism to stop that. In blocking policies, as well as in other projects and initiatives, it is a major challenge that there are no generally accepted definitions of extremism and terrorism. As pointed out again in the last report of the UN Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism, Ben Emerson, there are also conceptual shortcomings when it comes to differences between violent extremism and terrorism. The terms are often used without a clear definition of the boundaries between them. In several countries, we see that failing to clearly define the notion of extremism and similar offenses in anti-extremism laws led to abuses and attempts to curtail legitimate political debate. This may have a chilling effect on journalists working on matters of public interest, and I would say it already has. Only this week, 2 prominent journalists and human rights activists were detained in Turkey, as I told you. And this is just one drop in a sea of problems. There are more than 30 journalists in prison in Turkey on terrorism charges. There were 120 in 2010 when I started my mandate, and they were released in a process of democratization, when we thought there is some sort of hope when it comes to respect of human rights in Turkey. And at the moment, as I said, 30 and increasing almost every day. So how do we deal with this problem that we see in so many countries that are surrounding European Union? Not to mention the countries that are candidate and potential candidate countries to the EU. Also, social media networks are under pressure to censor hate speech online. Less than a month ago, and Toniste mentioned this initiative, Facebook, Twitter, Google, and other tech giants agreed to an EU code of conduct. Among others, they agreed to review valid requests for removal of illegal hate speech in less than 24 hours and to remove or disable access to the content if necessary. Tech companies should have a role in combating violent extremism online, but I think it is problematic that tech companies, as stated in this code, should take the lead in policing controversial speech online based on purely defined codes of conduct and concepts and outside of an accountable democratic framework. In this way, the law runs the risk of being downgraded to a second-class status, to use words of Access Now, one of the many NGOs protesting to this agreement. The problem I have with this agreement as the OSCE representative on freedom of the media is the fact that the responsibility is shifted from the state to the industry. And this is a problem. And this is a problem also giving this responsibility to the ISPs, intermediaries. They should not do this. Cooperation is great, but as it states now in this code, there are several very problematic clauses that can definitely interfere with free speech, freedom of the media, and respect of human rights. Short-term and long-term. Ladies and gentlemen, freedom of expression should be looked at as a tool and possibility to counter violent extremism and terrorism, and not as a restraint. This is one of the key messages I gave together with other international rapporteurs on freedom of expression in a joint declaration on freedom of expression and countering violent extremism issued on this year's World Press Freedom Day. It is available online. I also brought some copies here with me. We sent it to all governments and all international organizations, hoping that they will read it and remember how important it is to respect our human rights even in difficult times. Freedom of expression plays a critical role in promoting equality and in combating intolerance. Media, the internet, and other digital technologies plays an essential role in keeping society informed and to provide avenues for counter-speech, which I also think is a topic that should be discussed. How to fight problematic speech, how to counter this speech. I would always say with more speech and not with restrictions. In my view, a more interesting and sustainable solution that was made part of the recently launched EU Code of Conduct Agreement is the tech companies' commitment to strengthen their cooperation with civil society organizations that help flag hateful content when it goes online and promote counter-narratives to hate speech. It is positive that intermediaries are being called upon to engage in more proactive and efficient strategy by using their capabilities in communicating against violent extremism. And we see that social media networks are responding by increasingly engaging in outreach activities and partnering with organizations working on countering violent extremist content to empower credible non-governmental voices. As it was pointed out in a study made by the British think tank Demos for Facebook last year, combating extremism with counter-speech is faster, more flexible and responsive, capable of dealing with extremism from anywhere and in any language, and retains the principle of free and open public spaces for debate. Free speech and free media do not come naturally and can never be taken for granted. These values must be constantly justified, reaffirmed, and strengthened along with other fundamental human rights and freedoms. Free speech, privacy, and other liberties are the most precious values we have in our society. Limiting the space for freedom of expression and civic space advances the goals of those promoting, threatening, and using terrorism and violence. If we start giving up on our fundamental freedoms, we will erode the very substance of democracy and the rule of law. We should be thinking in terms of the new ways to connect and bring closer human rights and security in the 21st century. We must remember that human rights, though they may be temporarily suppressed, will always rebound, and that there is no security without free flow of information. Freedom of expression and free media play important roles in fostering meaningful debate on security issues and can help us to effectively address new challenges. By pitting human rights concerns and security issues against each other, we run the risk that both will be conquered. We may find ourselves with no security and no rights, and this is the last thing we want. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have some time for questions. Who would like to go first? You, sir. And if you could also say what your name is and what organization you come from.
And I'm just conscious of the role terms like extremism and terrorism play secretly in the background, but incredibly powerfully in shaping people's attitudes and make it very easy to isolate a voice, an opinion that one doesn't like. Your examples from Turkey would be good ones as well of the same thing. So how confident are we in our use of those terms that we're not simply picking up some of the narrative which comes directly from imperialism and our well-trodden path in that area in Europe, and simply applying it to the latest set of enemies, and in that way reinforcing attitudes that are profoundly anti-libertarian and anti-democratic. Thanks.
I completely agree, I think what you just said, and in a way asked the question, are we confident enough? I think we are too confident in pointing our finger at people and labeling them as terrorists and extremists. And I talk based on the cases, on the real life stories, about people that I just mentioned during my speech, that are now labeled as potential terrorists in Turkey because they simply disagreed with the government's view and they were challenging government policies and criticizing, and they were probably provocative. So it is very easy to use the term of terrorism, particularly, in order to label people without thorough investigation, without really looking, if there is anything there inciting, violence. And what it happens in Turkey is that most of the cases you have journalists labeled as terrorists. So how come you have so many journalists engaging in terrorism? Of course, each and every case needs to be investigated, and each and every case deserves particular attention in order to really see if there is a threat to the state or to the society. But from my position as the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, unfortunately I cannot say that I'm confident that this is really investigated in a right way, not just in Turkey, many other states. People are simply labeled as terrorists because of different views. And this is something we need to pay enormous attention to. And this is something that can affect political debate in the society and can affect well-being of the society. The moment you label somebody as a terrorist, that person is labeled. And nowadays it seems to me that we are so easily accepting this kind of rhetoric that can be extremely damaging.
Yes, sir. Yep. Put your hand in the air, yeah. White shirt. Sorry.
I just have a question. Some of the comments that the minister made, and then I'll go to the question. So I have a question. Oh, I want to reflect on what the minister said, and then I'll have a question for yourself. The minister said that we in Ireland are taking in, have accepted that we'll take in 4,000 refugees. And, but at present, according to Amnesty International, we've only taken in 4 over the last couple of months. Europe has stated very clearly that it believes in values like democracy, human rights, freedom of speech, liberty. Yet, when it comes to a counter-narrative, which you were speaking of, about promoting these values, we seem to be unable to really emphasize our beliefs, really emphasize our government and our institutions aren't really applying those values and beliefs at a policy level, or at least if they are very slow to react to the real situations that are happening, for instance, in the Mediterranean, or where it comes to, online propaganda or the promotion of terrorism. So, on a value issue, do we really have the commitment of our values, or do we really believe in our values? Because, as the minister said, you have made a value judgment that you're going to take in 4,000 refugees, but you've only taken in 4 as of yet, according to Amnesty International. So, how do we adjust those values with actual practical positions that are applied?
Can you get a microphone?
I don't want to take from the topic under discussion, but just to put the facts on the table. We've media present here as well, and for the sake of everybody who's in the room, at the end of September we'll have taken 500 refugees under the resettlement programme, which is from the camps in Lebanon. And that's a very important programme we've been part of. It's called the resettlement programme. The European Union has had particularly difficulties in relation to the relocation problem because of the movement of refugees right through up to Germany and Sweden, and so the hotspots that were being established have been somewhat slow. But that's been resolved now, and we're expecting far more refugees to be arriving right across Europe, because the various issues in relation to the establishment and the identification of refugees are now being dealt with properly. But as I say, I don't want to distract from the core topic, but just to put those facts on the table.
Any questions for the keynote?
Sometimes we see those wonderful words on paper, and then in practice we have a completely different situation, because it's simply not respected. And we have all these wonderful resolutions and conventions and human rights, but then in practice what you see is a completely different story. But I do not think I understood your question correctly. I mean, do we have values? I mean, each and every person probably has values.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jerry. I have a super quick question about our perception in terms of terrorist news agencies. So there are so many terrorist news agencies around the world in different countries targeting different languages. A good example of this would be the Amaq news agency affiliated with ISIS, an official ISIS mouthpiece. Will we be protecting their freedom of speech and their journalists as well if we're moving forwards with giving more freedom of speech to journalism? Will that include journalists of terrorist news agencies as well? Thank you.
Anything that has, but this is again also my view, and it's not something that is written on paper. I see very clear red line when it comes to free speech, and it's probably related to the part of the world that I come from. I already said I'm from Bosnia and Herzegovina. We experienced the use of propaganda, the use of media for injecting hatred, division, killing people, ethnic cleansing. This is not free speech. This is not journalism. This is, I would say, anarchy. This is something that has to be vigorously tackled by the rule of law, and measures need to be taken in order to stop anything that is inciting violence or calling for act of killing people. So that would be my answer to this. But if people are provocative, if people are criticizing, if people are even saying things we do not like or we completely disagree, those voices should be heard and they should not be suppressed. But if that has nothing to do with fighting violence, hatred, and calling for killing of different races or people of different opinions, or anything that is related to killing of individuals, which unfortunately we see on so many occasions. So the clear answer is that's not free speech that I would protect, and that is not my role.
Anybody else? Amy McKee. Take your mic, Amy.
Sorry. Amy, I'm a psychologist for the UK Counter-Terrorism Policing. I'm not, this is more just wondering about your thoughts on it, really. The recent case in America where Apple refused to help us unlock the iPhones of the shooters. I wondered what your thoughts were around the checks and balances around that kind of process and the legal arguments that went on around that. Thank you.
That particular case was well covered by a colleague of mine that I already mentioned, David Kay, who is the UN rapporteur, and he wrote a very good article on it. He was not for the use of particular key in order to open or to give the for opening, because he thought, like many other who were engaged in this debate, that FBI already has possibilities to do this without the engagement of tech firms, and at the end we learned that it was done by a hacker, if that was the whole truth about the case. But what stayed at the end is that definitely industry, intermediaries, search engines and these giants should not be used in order to provide this kind of opening. Many had completely different views on this. But I think that the civil society had a long-term view and also concerns that this will open Pandora's box. And this was the main problem. So it was not just this one particular case. It was actually what would be created with this example if it was used, if Apple agreed to it in the future with China, with Russia, and with many other countries that were just waiting for this kind of opportunity as an open door for this. So as a free speech advocate, I would stand on that side. But at the same time, I also think we need to recognize the real threats and what needs to be done sometimes. At the end, this case was somehow solved, but I'm sure we will have more cases similar and even more complicated in the future that we will have to deal with. And that is why I think a cooperation and coordination of agencies working on these things with civil society, with industry is crucial, but not by ordering certain companies to do the work of the police or investigation, or not to mention judiciary.
Any other questions? Down the back.
Hi, I appreciated the point made earlier that the terminology we use comes mostly from the security field. I would be interested in exploring new sources of that terminology. Do you have other suggestions?
Suggestions for terminology.
As opposed to terrorism, violent extremism, radicalization?
No, I don't have a suggestion. It's not again my role to have suggestions for something. The problem is that they are so vaguely defined in certain documents and legislations, and that is why they are affecting free speech and free media in the long term. When it comes to labeling people as terrorists, then not terrorists, then I have a problem. So there are other terms that are already existing. You can say that the person is provoking certain arguments or is provoking certain disagreements in society, but you cannot just simply label a person as a terrorist because this is something that gentleman just before was stating, that we are in a way too confident in using these terms without real discussion and without really going into the topic and really trying to see if this is terrorism or is just some kind of extreme views that are challenging society. We should not shy away, or we should not try to avoid controversial, provocative discussions. Somehow we are becoming more vulnerable to certain issues that are discussed in society. When it comes to offending people, again, we keep forgetting there is no human right not to be offended. Of course, there is no duty to offend people, but at the same time, we need to accept speech that is controversial. And by labeling it terrorists in certain cases or extremists, it can create huge problems. And it's already created, but I don't have a suggestion for a different terminology.
David, go ahead.
Hi, David Shanzer from Duke University. Just kind of following up on that question, especially with our lone actor terrorism, So law enforcement authorities face a pretty big challenge in trying to prevent these. And sometimes the earliest clues might be things that people are saying on social media and so on. I think in the United States, our FBI, they try very hard, I think, to make a distinction between pure First Amendment activities and conduct in terms of when an investigation can even be opened. I'm not talking about somebody being arrested or publicly labeled a terrorist, but I'm saying when you start an investigation. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on when it's okay in a democracy for a law enforcement entity to look at First Amendment kind of activities or speech as, not something that you can be arrested for, but something you can be can open an investigation based on what you say rather than what you do.
If we know the answer to this, probably we will not be here discussing this. But when it comes to First Amendment and the way it is handled in the US, it is quite different than here in Europe for obvious reason, because of different laws and protection that free speech has in US. When it's a time for the law enforcement agencies and judiciary to look at, it is again when it is crossing this red line, which is very difficult to define, and that is, again, calling for incitement, calling for killing people, and definitely not in the area of protection of human rights, including free speech and freedom of the media. So what is also problematic, I do not think that the law enforcement agencies are trained or equipped enough in order to be able to tackle these issues properly. There is a need for them, and this is something that we are trying to do in our work, to tell them that they need to engage with the civil society, not to mention academia and all others dealing with this issue. We have a huge problem with countering abuse of female journalists online, female journalists and bloggers. This is completely another area of the one we are discussing here. But the main problem we see is that the law enforcement agencies, they do not know how to address these issues and when to act and when to take these cases to judiciary. There are many journalists and bloggers, female journalists and bloggers, closing their accounts, switching their Twitter or Facebook accounts because of online abuse, rape threats, and death threats. That's not part of free speech debate. That is crime, and that should be tackled. But I agree with you that there is a huge gap there, and that law enforcement in many countries are not really, again, equipped enough or educated enough in order to know when to use certain communication in order to tackle it. And the same goes for online extremism and terrorism. In so many cases, you see when the case is revealed, and then you read it, and then you realize there is nothing there, but just an attempt to have some discussion. And fear is in a way driving, all of us discussing this issue, because we still do not know how to tackle the problems that we are facing in our societies. We are still tapping in the dark, and that is why I think it's extremely important to have coordination, but I would also say more transparency in all the attempts.
Okay, we've got time for one last question. Daniela.
My name is Daniela Pizarro from University of Hamburg and VOX-Pol. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the issue of media responsibility when reporting on terrorism? Because as we all know, of course, terrorists do want a lot of exposure, and media just gives it to them every time. So do you have these kind of discussions as well in your work? Thanks.
Of course, I mean, this is not just when it comes to this subject. When it comes to any sensitive issue, there is a need for a really high level of responsibility. In addition to this, what is needed is media pluralism that many countries enjoy, like this country here, But in so many parts of the OSCE region and beyond, you only have state broadcasters. So they are reporting only what the government is telling them to report. And that is a huge problem. So when it comes to responsibility, sometimes you need to protect the voices that are challenging the views of the governments that is telling society that everything is fine and nothing is bad. So how to bring these two together and how to talk about the responsibility at the same time, it's difficult. It's not something, you know, it can be like a general view about the whole region. We work with media outlets, with media companies on building code of conduct. The latest we did is how to report on refugee issues. My office is not School of Journalism. I'm not telling journalists how to do their job, but I do work with Deutsche Welle, with BBC School of Journalism, many wonderful NGOs around the world, training and really trying to help in this process. But then, you know, you sometimes come to the wall and you see the situation in certain country. I don't have to name it. I mean, you would probably come up with many examples where there is no possibility for society to really learn what is happening because there is no independent media, there are no any differing voices, and there is just only one view that is very careful and very neutral, telling people what is going on. And that is also wrong. So when it comes to responsibility, there are always question marks, and I have to look at, as the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, on case-by-case basis, because sometimes government, they talk about responsibilities, and responsibility for them means not to criticize, not to provoke, not to open subjects that are sensitive. And then we come to the situation where there is complete dark, and what is left is online media and independent NGOs and reporters trying to report about the issues of the society. But that, again, you know, those are extreme cases. You know, this is something that is not happening in this part of the world and, you know, I would say in Europe. But in places that I work, it's definitely the case. Responsibility is a very dangerous term that I try not to use. I call it rather professionalism, because responsibility in many states means just be quiet and do not criticize the president, otherwise you will end up in prison.
Okay, thanks very much. No more time, no more questions, John, I'm afraid. That brings an end to the first keynote session. There's a break now for half an hour in the main restaurant. I'd like to invite you all to thank Dunja Mijatović for a great start to the conference.